Claude responded. My lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:12. My lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:12. Not her paralegal, not the automated appointment confirmation that clutters my inbox every month. Rita Vance herself, calling from her cell phone, which I knew because I had that number saved for 11 years and because in all that time, Rita Vance had never once called me directly about anything. I was in my garage in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sanding down an old rocking chair that had belonged to my father. I picked up on the first ring. She said, Walter, it's Rita. I need you to come to my office this afternoon. Are you free? I said. What's going on? She said, I'd rather show you than tell you. Can you be here by 5? There was something underneath her voice I noticed right away. Not panic. Rita Vance did not do panic. She was a careful, exacting estate attorney who had practiced law in Tulsa for over 20 years and who chose her words the way a surgeon chooses an incision, precisely and only where necessary. What I heard was the tone of someone who had found something they didn't yet fully understand and who was being deliberate about how they delivered it. I said, I'll be there at 5. I finished sanding the chair leg I was working on. I fed the 2 barn cats that had adopted our porch the year my wife passed, cats she'd named Milton and Fig before she ever got the chance to properly feed them herself. I washed my hands, put on a clean shirt, and drove to Rita's office on Cherry Street. She met me in the lobby instead of having her assistant send me back, which was unusual, and she walked me straight to her private office rather than a conference room. She closed the door. She sat down across from me. She slid a thick envelope across the desk. She said, Walter, a filing was submitted to the Tulsa County Probate Court 11 days ago. It's a petition to establish a limited guardianship over your financial affairs. The petition includes 2 psychological evaluations and a letter from a physician stating you have early-stage cognitive impairment and diminished capacity to manage your own assets. I looked at the envelope. She said, Walter, I pulled the physician's name listed on that letter. It's Dr. Ann Whitfield. Do you know her? I said, never heard of her in my life. She said, that's what I suspected. I called her office this morning under the pretense of confirming an appointment. She has no record of you as a patient. Not now, not ever. I opened the envelope. The first page was a cover sheet from the Tulsa County Probate Court, case number stamped in the corner, my full name typed at the top, Walter Eugene Pruitt. I turned to the next page. A psychological evaluation, dated the 9th of March, describing moderate short-term memory loss, difficulty with sequential reasoning, and vulnerability to undue influence in financial decision-making. I turned another page. A second evaluation, dated the 2nd of May, describing progression of the same symptoms and a formal recommendation that a guardian be appointed to oversee my bank accounts, my property, and my monthly disbursements. At the bottom of the second evaluation was a signature, Dr. Ann Whitfield, with a medical license number printed beneath it. It looked competent enough to survive a glance. I turned to the last page, the actual petition, filed by a man named Roy Callender, who identified himself in the filing as my nephew and closest living relative willing to take on the responsibility of my care. I looked up from the papers. Rita was watching me with the particular stillness of a person who has delivered hard news before and knows enough to let the silence sit. I said, Rita, I have never been evaluated by a psychologist in my life, not once. She said, I believe you. I said, these dates. Dates. March 9th and May 2nd. On March 9th, I was in Springfield, Missouri, at my granddaughter's college graduation. I have photographs with a timestamp, a hotel receipt, and 40 people who can confirm I was standing in that auditorium. On May 2nd, I was at St. Francis Hospital getting a hip x-ray, and I still have the discharge paperwork sitting in the drawer of my kitchen desk. She said, I know, Walter. That's exactly why I called you in. I said, someone submitted paperwork to a judge saying I've lost my mind. Using dates I can prove I wasn't losing it. She said, yes. I said, who is Roy Callender? Yes. Rita reached for a printed page at the corner of her desk. She said, according to the filing, he's your late sister's son. He lists himself as your nephew and states that you have no immediate family capable of providing oversight. I set the envelope down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he's making a conscious decision not to crush it in his hands. I looked out Rita's window at Cherry Street, at the ordinary Tuesday traffic moving past, at people going about a day that had no idea what was happening on the fourth floor above them. Rita said, "Walter, I already called the probate clerk's office before I called you. The hearing on this petition is scheduled for 3 weeks from this Friday." 3 weeks. She said, "I wanted you to hear this from me before you saw it in the mail, and because whoever built this filing used a real license number and a real court. And I am not going to sit back while that happens to one of my clients." She reached for her own phone and dialed a number. She said into the receiver, "Denise, I need you to pull every file we have on Walter Pruitt going back to when his wife's estate closed and prepare a full chronology. I need it by tomorrow morning." She hung up and looked at me. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Everything you just started. And one more thing." She said, "Name it." I said, "Don't blink." She said, "Walter, Walter." I said, "Walter, I have never once blinked in 22 years of practicing law. I'm not about to start with you." I picked up the envelope, thanked her, and walked out through her lobby onto Cherry Street. I stood on the sidewalk in the June heat and looked down at the papers in my hand. Roy had filed a petition to have me declared incapable of managing my own life. He had used a real doctor's license number to make a lie look official. He had picked a court date 3 weeks out, and he had done all of this while calling me every other Sunday to ask how my hip was healing and whether I needed anything from the hardware store. I did not feel rage standing on that sidewalk. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to how the rest of this went. What I felt was something far more organized than rage. Something I recognized instantly because it had been the center of my working life for 36 years. I felt the risk take shape in front of me. I felt the full outline of what I was up against come into focus, and underneath all of it, I felt the flat, cold certainty of a man who has spent his whole career building systems to catch exactly this kind of thing before it happens. I knew precisely what I was dealing with. The only question left was what I was going to build to stop it. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 67 years old. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the man who filed that petition against me had made one very costly miscalculation. He had spent almost 2 years positioning himself around a widower he assumed was drifting into old age and confusion. What he had actually positioned himself around was 36 years of insurance fraud investigation and a filing habit that would make a federal auditor sit up straight. He had no idea, and he had 3 weeks before he found out. If you're the kind of person who calls your own family before you call a lawyer, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, because I read every single one of them. I spent 36 years as a claims investigator for one of the largest insurance carriers in the country. My entire job, every single day for over 3 decades, was determining whether a claim was real or manufactured. I sat across from people who had staged car accidents, faked injuries, forged medical records, and burned down their own garages for the payout, and I learned to read the seams where a fabricated story didn't quite match the physical world. After that many years, you stop thinking of documentation as a chore. It becomes a reflex, the same way a carpenter reaches for a level without thinking about it. You keep records not because you expect trouble, but because you've spent your whole life watching what happens to people who didn't. My wife, Carol Ann Pruitt, was a labor and delivery nurse for 31 years at Hillcrest Medical Center. She had the kind of steadiness that made frightened young mothers stop shaking the moment she walked into the room, and she kept a small spiral notebook in the drawer by her side of the bed where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. Recipes, names of birds at the feeder, things I'd said that made her laugh. Carol Ann was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2020 and passed in our bedroom in the fall of 2022, with both our daughter and our son beside her. I still keep her notebook in that same drawer. I've read it more times than I'll admit to anyone. We had 2 children. Our daughter Michelle was 42, a pharmacist in Springfield, Missouri, who called every Sunday without fail and drove up to Tulsa 3 separate times the winter after Carol Ann died, just to make sure I was eating something besides toast. Our son, Danny, was 39, and he had died in a construction accident 9 years earlier, which is a sentence I still have trouble writing even now. After Danny passed, my late sister Judith's boy, Roy, started showing up more. Roy Callender was 43 years old, worked in what he called wealth consulting, out of a strip mall office in Broken Arrow, and had the kind of practiced warmth that never seemed to run out, no matter how many times he used it. He remembered your birthday. He remembered how you took your coffee. He said the right thing at exactly the right moment, with the consistency of a man who understood that trust is built the same way a con is built, in small, believable increments. I had noticed, within a year of him re-entering my life, that Roy was a man who measured relationships the way other people measure square footage, not always consciously, but structurally. Carol Ann had noticed inside of 20 minutes the first time he came to dinner after Judith's funeral. She hadn't said much about it at the time. What she did say, driving home that night in 2016, was, "Walter, that boy is always calculating something." I told her I knew exactly what she meant. She said she knew I did. Argrok. The next several years were unremarkable on the surface. Roy came around for holidays. He asked thoughtful questions about my knees, my blood pressure, whether the house felt too big for one person now. What I noticed and quietly logged without confronting began around 2021. Questions about whether I'd updated my will since Danny passed. Comments about how much upkeep the property required for a man my age. Suggestions that he could take a look at my retirement accounts. Just as a favor. Professional courtesy. Nothing formal. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. It was the pattern of a man who had decided that closeness to something valuable was the same thing as owning part of it. Carol Ann had noticed that too, before she got sick. She told me once, sitting up in bed with her notebook in her lap, "Make sure everything is written down somewhere, and make sure somebody besides you knows where it is." I didn't fully understand the urgency in her voice at the time. I understood it fully 3 years later. After Carol Ann died, Roy's questions changed the way a strategy changes once one of its obstacles is removed. End quote. The retirement account comments became more specific. He started asking whether I'd considered giving him power of attorney just in case, given that I was living alone now and Danny was gone, and Michelle was 3 hours away in Missouri. I was walking 2 miles most mornings around the neighborhood pond. My doctor had told me at my last physical that my numbers looked better than men 15 years younger than me. I understood, standing in my own kitchen the day Roy first asked about power of attorney, that his concern had nothing to do with my well-being. What I hadn't understood yet was how far he had already decided to take it. I found out the day Rita called me at 3:12 on a Tuesday. I drove straight from Rita's office to the home of a private investigator she'd recommended years earlier, a retired Tulsa PD detective named Marlon Hayes, who worked out of a converted garage off Admiral Boulevard. I'd been given his name by Rita's office manager 2 years prior when I'd asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she knew anyone who handled family fraud cases. She'd said, "I know exactly one man who does that work well in this city, and he doesn't advertise. You just show up." I had filed that information away the way I filed most things, in a place I could put my hands on the moment I needed it. Marlon Hayes was 58, built like a man who had spent 30 years walking into situations other people ran from. And he was on the phone when I knocked on his open garage door. He held up one finger, finished his call inside of a minute, and said, "Sit down. Tell me what happened." I sat on a folding chair across from his desk. I put the envelope down between us. I said, "My nephew filed a guardianship petition against me in Tulsa County. He's using a psychological evaluation supposedly signed by a real physician, but that physician has no record of ever treating me. The hearing is in 3 weeks." Marlon looked at the envelope without touching it yet. He said, "How do you know it's fake?" I said, "Because I've never seen a psychologist in my life, and because my attorney called the physician's office this morning and confirmed I've never been a patient there." He said, "And you've got proof of where you actually were on these evaluation dates?" I said, "March 9th. I was in Springfield at my granddaughter's college graduation. I've got photographs, a hotel folio, and 40 witnesses. May 2nd. I was at St. Francis getting an x-ray on my hip. I've got the discharge summary, the parking garage timestamp, and the copay receipt." Marlon looked at me for a long moment. He said, "What'd you do for a living, before you retired?" I said, "Insurance claims investigator. 36 years, he said. "That explains the receipts." He pulled the envelope toward him and read in silence for almost 2 minutes, turning each page with the unhurried care of a man who had spent his career reading documents for the seam where the story didn't match the facts. He set the last page down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, this is elder fraud, plain and simple. If these documents are fabricated the way I think they are, Your nephew is looking at fraud on the court, identity misuse of a licensed physician, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, all separate felonies under Oklahoma law. I said, I know, he said. How do you want to handle this? I know, I said. I want the petition thrown out. I want the forged documents entered into a record that follows Roy Callender for the rest of his professional life. And I want to be sitting in that courtroom when it happens. Marlon was quiet a moment. Then he said, those are 3 reasonable things to want. He picked up a legal pad. Thanks for watching. He said, tell me everything, start to finish. Don't leave anything out because you think it doesn't matter. Let me decide what matters. I talked for almost an hour. He wrote the entire time and never once interrupted. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. Did Roy have legal access to any of my accounts? No. Everything had been redesignated to Michelle after Carol Ann passed. Did Michelle know what Roy had done? I told him I honestly didn't know, and I wanted to find out before I assumed anything either way. Did I have any written record of the conversations where Roy had brought up power of attorney in the will? I said I have handwritten notes on every meaningful conversation I've had with that man for the last 3 years. Old habits. Marlon set his pen down. He said, Walter, I've worked 11 of these cases in this county. Maybe 2 clients ever walked in here with what you just laid on this desk. I said. 36 years of investigating fraud does something to a man. Documentation stops being a task. It becomes instinct. He almost smiled. He said, let me tell you what we're going to do. Rita's office formally entered its appearance in the probate case that same week, which immediately changed the posture of the proceeding. An attorney's entry tells the court that the person named in the petition intends to be heard, not simply processed. Marlon spent the next several days digging, and what he found wasn't a crime built on impulse. It was an architecture. Roy had spent close to 2 years researching Oklahoma guardianship statutes, had found a document mill out of a mailbox service in Broken Arrow that produced convincing psychological evaluation templates, and had constructed a paper trail of appointments with Dr. Whitfield that had never taken place. He'd lifted her actual signature from a scanned referral letter she'd written years earlier, one that had circulated through Carol Ann's oncology paperwork during her illness, and had somehow ended up in a folder in my own filing cabinet during the estate settlement. He had used my dead wife's medical records to forge the signature that would strip me of my independence. I need you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it myself in Marlon's garage. Marlon also found that Roy had opened a business banking account under an entity called Callender Family Asset Management, registered 8 months earlier, with no clients, no revenue, and no deposits. A clean, empty shell built to receive something that hadn't arrived yet. When I told Rita about the account, she said, he built the container before he built the fraud. He expected you to already be halfway gone. I said, he's known me his whole life, she said. He saw what he wanted to see. A widower in his late 60s, alone in a big house, no son left to check in on him. He saw the outside and drew his own conclusion. I said, my wife told me years ago he was always calculating something. Rita said, she was right. He just had the wrong variables. Now I have to tell you about the call with Michelle, because it's the part of this whole thing that cost me the most, and the part I've turned over the most times since. I called her on a Thursday evening, 10 days before the hearing. Rita had told me the conversation needed to happen before I walked into that courtroom, so I'd know exactly where my daughter stood. Michelle picked up on the second ring, her regular voice tired from a shift at the pharmacy. I told her to listen all the way through before she said anything. Then I told her everything. The envelope, the forged signature, the empty bank account Marlon had found, all of it, without stopping once. When I finished, the line went quiet long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. She said, Dad, I didn't know anything about forged documents. I, 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 I. That is not a bad if we know that I want to know that I make and find out of my final forged documents. I swear to you I didn't know that. I said, what did you know? She said, Roy told me back in the spring that he was filing something to protect you, since you were living alone and Danny was gone and I was too far away to help day to day. He said you'd probably fight it at first because you're stubborn. He showed me a page of the filing, not the whole thing. He said the medical parts were complicated and I didn't need to read through all of it. I sat with that for a moment. The medical parts were complicated. The exact language a man uses when he needs someone compliant without being fully informed. I said, "Are you going to stand behind what Roy did, or are you going to tell the truth?" A long pause. A long pause. The sound of someone realizing something about her own life she'd been avoiding looking at directly. She said, "I'll tell the truth. All of it, whatever it costs." I said, "Meet with Rita tomorrow morning. Bring anything in writing, texts, emails, voicemails, whatever you've got," she said. "I have texts, Dad. A lot of them." I said, "I know, Michelle. And none of this changes how much I love you. But what Roy did is a crime, and what you do in the next 10 days matters a great deal for what comes after," she said quietly. "I know." At the end of the call, she said, I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions when he brought it up." I said, "Ask them starting now." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, thinking about something Carol Ann had once said about Roy, back before she got sick. In that careful way, she said the complicated things. He's family, and family gets the benefit of the doubt right up until the moment it costs you something you can't get back. Rita met with Michelle the next morning and called me that afternoon. 63 text messages spanning 11 months. Michelle had known there was some kind of legal filing in progress. She had not known the medical documents were forged. She had been misled by her own cousin, plainly and provably. Rita also told me she'd filed a formal complaint with the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office, on top of the medical board complaint. Dr. Whitfield's practice had already initiated once they learned their physician's name had been used without her knowledge. Rita asked if I was ready for the hearing. I told her I'd been ready since I was standing on the sidewalk on Cherry Street, with that envelope in my hand. Michelle drove up from Springfield the night before the hearing without me asking her to. She called at 4 to say she was leaving and got in around 8:30. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her everything again, start to finish, and she listened the whole way through without interrupting, the same way her mother used to listen. When I finished, she looked at the table for a moment and asked if I was okay. I told her I was functional. She said, "That's not the same thing, Dad." I said, "No, it isn't." "Okay comes after tomorrow," she said. "Mom used to say you were better at taking care of everyone else than yourself." I said, "She wasn't wrong about much." We talked until almost midnight. I lay awake afterward, not anxious, just fully alert, the way you lie awake the night before something important, not from fear, but from being completely present to it. I thought about Carol Ann's notebook in the nightstand drawer. I thought about 36 years spent building the habit of writing everything down, and what it means when that habit outlives the reason you started it. Then I slept. The Tulsa County Courthouse on Friday morning was unremarkable in the way courthouses always are. Tan corridors and fluorescent light, and decades of routine procedure worn into the floor tile. Rita met me in the hallway at 8:45. Michelle stood beside me. Marlon Hayes showed up at 8:50 because Rita had asked him to be present, and he'd said yes without hesitation. At 9:02, Roy and his attorney arrived. His attorney was a heavy-set man named Philip Grady who had the look of someone expecting a routine morning. Roy wore a gray suit, groomed and composed, carrying himself like a man who expected to walk out of that room with something he'd spent 2 years building toward. He saw me in the hallway and his expression shifted for half a second before he recovered it. He said, "Uncle Walter, I didn't expect you'd come yourself." I said, "It's a hearing about whether I can still run my own life, Roy." "Where else would I be?" he said. "I hope you know, this comes from a place of real concern." I said, I said, "I know exactly where it comes from." His attorney put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the courtroom doors. The judge was the Honorable Diane Castellano, 16 years on the Tulsa County bench, known for having very little patience for filings that wasted the court's time. She reviewed the file, looked up, and asked counsel to identify themselves for the record. Philip Grady identified himself as counsel for the petitioner, Roy Callender. Rita identified herself as counsel for the respondent, me. Judge Castellano looked at Rita for a moment and confirmed for the record that I was present and consented to the hearing proceeding today. I said, "I'm present, Your Honor, and I more than consent." I asked that this date be kept exactly as scheduled. The judge studied me with an expression that was carefully neutral but seemed, underneath it, close to genuine interest. She told Philip Grady he could present the basis for the petition. He stood and walked through it in the practiced language of a man who had made this kind of argument before, referencing the psychological evaluations, the physician's letter, describing a pattern of documented cognitive decline, and a nephew acting out of concern for a vulnerable, isolated relative. He named the physician of record as Dr. Ann Whitfield. Judge Castellano looked toward the gallery, where Marlon sat beside a woman from Dr. Whitfield's practice, an office administrator named Susan Reyes, who had come at Rita's request. The judge asked if anyone present could speak to the physician's actual records. Susan Reyes stood and identified herself. The judge asked her directly whether Dr. Whitfield had ever treated me. Susan said, "No, Your Honor. Dr. Whitfield has no patient record for Walter Pruitt. Not now. Not at any point. Not. We confirmed this internally after receiving an inquiry from Mr. Pruitt's attorney, and we've since reported the unauthorized use of Dr. Whitfield's name and license number to the Oklahoma Medical Board. The courtroom did the thing courtrooms do when something real happens inside them, where everyone in the room goes a little more still than they were a moment before. Not for show. The stillness of people recalculating. Philip Grady stood frozen at the petitioner's table. Roy sat beside him, and I watched his face in the seconds after Susan Reyes spoke. 36 years of fraud investigation teaches you to watch the exact instant a story collides with the facts underneath it, the moment the version a person built stops holding its shape. I had watched that moment across 1,000 kitchen tables and claims offices over my career. What I saw on Roy's face was a man understanding, in real time, that the structure he'd spent 2 years building had failed completely, not partway. Judge Castellano said, "Mr. Grady, I want to be very clear with you. The court has just heard testimony that the medical documentation underlying this petition does not correspond to any real patient relationship. Do you have a response?" Philip Grady said, and his voice had lost the confident register it carried at the start of the hearing. "Your Honor, I was not informed of any issue with this documentation prior to this morning." The judge looked at him, then at Roy. She said, "Mr. Callender, are you the petitioner in this matter?" Roy stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "Are you aware that knowingly submitting fraudulent medical documentation to this court constitutes a felony under Oklahoma law, having on?" Silence. Then Roy said, "Your Honor, I can explain." She said, "I expect you'll have that opportunity, but not with me today." She looked toward Rita, then back at the file. She said, "I am suspending this petition. I am not simply dismissing it. I am referring the fraudulent documentation to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office for criminal review, and I am entering a formal notation in this record that no legitimate clinical basis has ever been established for this filing. Mr. Pruitt, I want it stated clearly for the record that there is no finding of any kind against you in this proceeding, and that this court takes seriously what you've been subjected to." She looked at Roy one final time and said, "Mr. Callender, I strongly suggest you speak with your attorney about what comes next. This court is adjourned." She stood and left, and the room reorganized itself the way a room does in the seconds after something significant has just happened in it. Rita touched my arm and said quietly, "That went exactly the way it needed to." Michelle stood beside me and didn't say anything at all. Just put her hand on my shoulder and left it there, which was exactly the right thing to do. I looked across the room at the petitioner's table. Philip Grady was leaning toward Roy, talking low and fast. Roy sat very still, the suit and the haircut and all the composure still technically in place and meaning nothing anymore. He was not the same man who had walked into that courthouse an hour earlier with a plan and a position and 2 years of groundwork behind him. He looked up once, not deliberately at me, just the involuntary way people look around when they're trying to reassemble a world that's just come apart around them. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't look away. I didn't say a word. I just watched him with the expression of a man who had calculated this exact outcome 2 weeks earlier and found the numbers landing precisely where he'd expected. Then I picked up my jacket and walked out of the Tulsa County Courthouse into the June morning with my daughter beside me and my attorney behind me, and the envelope that had started it all tucked under Rita's arm as evidence in a case that was only just beginning. The Tulsa County District Attorney's Office opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks of the hearing. Roy was charged that fall with fraud upon the court. unauthorized use of a licensed physician's credentials, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, the exact language Oklahoma law uses for what he had planned to do to my life. He was let go from his consulting firm the week the charges became public. I didn't follow every detail of what happened to him after that, because I didn't need to. Michelle stopped speaking to Roy entirely, and brought every one of her 63 text messages to Rita's office without being asked twice. She and her husband started driving up to Tulsa most weekends instead of every few months. The first dinner she came to afterward, we sat at my kitchen table, just the two of us, without the strain that had been sitting over every conversation for the past year. She asked, "Dad, did Mom ever suspect something about Roy?" I said, "Your mother had a way of knowing things before most people finished thinking them." She asked, what her mother had known. "See," I said. She knew. He was always calculating something. She just didn't live long enough to see exactly what it was. Michelle looked down at her plate for a moment, then said, "I should have asked more questions back when I had the chance." I said, "Ask them now. You've got plenty of time left to." Carol Ann's notebook is still in the nightstand drawer. I haven't moved it. Milton and Fig still show up on the back porch every morning around the same time, and I still buy the same cat food she used to buy, the brand she researched for weeks before she settled on it. My house and my accounts are held in a trust Rita drew up for me that same fall, with Michelle named as trustee and successor, everything documented down to the last account number. I'm 67 years old. I still walk 2 miles around the pond most mornings. I keep handwritten notes on every conversation that matters, and I could hand any auditor in this country a filing system they could understand inside of 15 minutes. The papers that claimed I couldn't manage my own life are sitting in a court record now as evidence of a felony. That's the only record of me that matters. My father used to tell me a man is worth exactly what he builds and what he's willing to protect. He drove a delivery truck out of Muskogee for 30 years and never once left a debt unpaid or a promise unkept. I absorbed that from him the same way I absorbed most things, without ever being sat down and told. I built something over a lifetime. Somebody tried to take it from me quietly, banking on the idea that I was too old and too alone to notice. I protected it with 36 years of habit, one very good attorney, and a physician's office willing to pick up the phone and tell the truth the moment they were asked. That's the inheritance that actually holds up. If any part of this reminded you of someone in your own family, tell me about it in the comments, and let me know if you're a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, or somebody watching this thinking about your own mother or father tonight. Take care of the people who took care of you, and don't wait until there's a folder on somebody's desk to start paying attention. Claude responded, "Love doesn't ask you to stop noticing things sometimes. The most caring thing you can do for the people you love is write it down. Ask the second question. Key. Love doesn't ask you to stop noticing things sometimes. The most caring thing you can do for the people you love is write it down. Ask the second question. Keep the receipt." Walter didn't win because he stopped trusting his family. He won because he never stopped paying attention to the details that mattered. That habit isn't cold. It's a quiet form of devotion. Keep your notes, keep your people close, and keep asking. Hass. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hopefully leaving you with a genuine, positive life lesson.